You've entered BOOKSTORM with Kristen Civiletto and me, Chris Storm. This is a podcast devoted to best-selling books that matter, books that make a difference. We're diving down deep with beloved authors about their stories. We're exposing hot-button topics and heartfelt themes, the issues that affect each of us in our own lives, as siblings, parents, partners, friends, as human beings. We're braving new ideas, fresh thoughts, hard lessons, and important truths. Those kinds of things that stay with us long after we turn the last page and close the book. Welcome back, book lovers, literally all over the world. We're super happy to have you back here today. We know why you're loyal followers, because it's authors like we have with us here today. We're very, very pleased and honored when we get an author to come back for a second time. And we have HeatherB.Moore here with us today. Welcome back, Heather.
Thank you so much for having me. I've been excited to meet with you again ever since our first interview about a year ago.
That makes us happy. We had you for Under the Java Moon. Now today we have you for Lady Flyer. Kristen and I really enjoyed it. We can't wait to dive down deep. But as you know, we like to tell our listeners a little bit about you before we get started. Heather is a USA Today bestseller and award-winning author. Now, I clarified this with her before she came on. Yes, 90 books, maybe even over 100 now, Heather?
I think it's just over 100.
Wow, that's
Probably
amazing.
need to count.
That's amazing. You write primarily historical and hashtag her story fiction about the humanity and heroism of the everyday person. That's why we love it so much. You publishing in a breadth of genres. You dive into the hearts and souls of the characters. Yes, we can attest to that. You're meshing your love for research with your love for storytelling. And I want to tell our listeners, so Heather's historicals and thrillers are written under the pen name H.B. Moore. She writes women's fiction, romance, and inspi nonfiction under HeatherB.Moore. She writes speculative fiction under Jane Red. And then you add this in your bio, which I think is funny. This can all be quite confusing, so her kids just call her mom.
Right.
You know what else I got? I was telling Kristen, I really admire that you are transitioning to all these different genres, because seldom authors feel the freedom to do that. But we're not limited in our writing ability, and you're exceeding in every one of those. Thank you for doing that. Now,
You're welcome.
one more cool thing about you. She attended the Cairo American College in Egypt, the Anglican School of Jerusalem in Israel. And I love this. Despite failing your AP high school English exam, you decided to be a writer. That's a good thing too. And earned a Bachelor of Science at Brigham Young University in something other than English. Okay, you're giving us all hope for anyone who wants to pursue a career and maybe they had a little mini failure or someone told them not to do it. Go for it. That's great.
Right, exactly.
Thank you. Good to see you again.
Thank you.
Well, Heather, we're here to talk about your newest release, Lady Flyer. We love this cover. We loved the book. And Chris and I have been talking about all kinds of themes with your book for the past couple of weeks. So as you might remember, I like to give just a little background of what's going on in the story for our listeners. And if you want to add anything, please be our guest, since you are our guest. Now, in this story, we first meet our protagonist when she is 16. She's living in Houghton, Michigan. And she sees these barnstormer pilots that are doing these tricks and these amazing things with these very early airplanes. She has an experience that just ignites a fire in her, and she vows one day that she wants to fly airplanes. Now, back then, women weren't doing any such thing, but in her mind, that was not a deterrent. As the years go on, we have these gathering storm clouds of World War II, and she's got an idea. Women can be a part of the war effort. And so she wants to do that as an aviator. Now, there are other women who are like-minded, who have that same passion. And so throughout the story, we see where Nancy Harkness gathers with other women. They get training. They start to go in the direction of their dreams. And it was just amazing because of the obstacles that they encountered, external, internal. And wow, what an inspiring story. Did you want to add anything to that backdrop?
Yeah, I thought it was really interesting because when I started researching this book, after World War One, there's this huge planes surplus. And so we had all these planes, they're actually quite cheap to buy. And so you had these pilots returning from war, and so they'd buy their own planes. And there's only so many jobs out there. So they would go to these small towns and they're called barnstormers. They would take people on stunt rides, and that's kind of how they made money. So Nancy, that really is where her passion started, is going up on a ride with a barnstormer. And I don't think she knew how much she was going to love it until she actually tried it.
Yeah, she put a lot on the line, even money-wise, to make that
Mhm.
happen. I thought that was a fantastic introduction because we saw that passion ignited.
Well, yes, she was a daredevil, let's face it. And she loved the thrill of flying. And I just wanted to be her throughout the whole story. One thing that you showed us during this time period in history is that Nancy had a lot of bigoted prejudices against her being a pilot. Um, I was happy to see that she had some key supporters who were men. She had her father, her brother Robert, her boyfriend Bob Love, and her brother offered her these lasting words that I really loved. Don't ever stop flying, sis. Promise me you won't. You made history come alive for us in the very hearts of the people that are gone from this world. Women and all marginalized people will be empowered by this story. I want to say for our listeners, here is something surprising. Nancy's mother did not want her to fly. Nancy's headmaster at her school, Milton, a woman, was appalled by her flying. There was something heartbreaking about women not supporting women during that time. We still sometimes see it today. I had to ask you, in your research of Nancy, was she driven just because of her passion for flight, or maybe the fierce opposition ignited a little fire inside her?
Yeah, I think there's probably multiple answers to that. There's probably a lot of layers we're dealing with. First of all, of course, there's a cultural norms of the time and the expectation of being a lady and following traditional roles. That would have obviously been foremost in Nancy's mother's mind. And also, as a mother of a daughter who is in pilot school, I kind of understand the worries. And every time I see in the news there's a small plane crash, I just feel sick to my stomach. So I could see some of that with Nancy's mother. The other thing is Nancy was from a well-to-do family, and so there's probably additional expectations, where you don't get dirty, you don't put on a flight jacket, you don't jump in a plane and act like you're a mechanic. Or in fact, I know my own grandmother, she didn't drive until she was almost 40 years old. So even driving a car for some women wasn't really the thing to do. But ironically, because her family did have money, of course, before the stock market crash, they were able to afford her to pay for flying lessons. And I honestly think that Nancy's passion kind of took her by surprise. When she was a young teenager, she was in Paris on a trip with her aunt, and she did see the landing of Charles Lindbergh when he flew the first transatlantic flight. So she knew about aviation. She was seeing it growing and developing and becoming this really amazing concept around her. And there's inventions, it seems like every day. And so when she did kind of do the daredevil thing and go up on that barnstormer flight, she just felt that exhilaration. She felt like there's no barriers, there's no gender barriers, there's no economic barriers, that she was just above all of that. Any pettiness in the world, she was above it. But yeah, like you mentioned, she did have support from her father, which maybe in his mind he was like, oh, she's just at the local airfield flying in circles is okay. He probably didn't realize what she really was going to do eventually. And her brother was kind of a daredevil himself. He was always pushing the envelope, and he just was that kind of man that he just didn't seem to have any pretense. He's a bit of a maverick, and he just was excited about his little sister following her passion.
Yeah, I love that. And so I have to say, little shout out to your daughter, how proud you must be of her doing this. And there was something in Nancy in that first scene where she continued to try to go home and find more money to pay the barnstormer to take her up into the air. And so same with your daughter. In all women, I think when you find that passion, whatever it might be, as I've said to my own kids, you have to seize it, because that is probably what you're going to be good at. It's probably going to be your gift. And you may not be happy every day, but for the most part, you're going to love your life.
Yep. Yeah, you're willing to fight for it. If it's your passion, you're going to have the down days, but they're not going to set you back.
That's great.
I want to ask you, Heather, Nancy and some of the other originals, as they were called, experienced very profound disappointment after a decision by the military. There were planes that were sitting grounded in Niagara Falls, my hometown, and elsewhere, and they were in need of pilots, but they were not happy about what the military had decided to do. And I don't want to give too much away. Something Bob said to her at the time really struck me, and I want to ask you a question about it. He said, "Without you, the tide of war wouldn't have changed so soon. Women working in the manufacturing plants, women mechanics building warplanes, women delivering the planes to the air bases, you were the backbone." Now, at that time, neither Nancy nor Bob could have foreseen what was about to happen just 20 years later in the 1960s with women and the feminist movement. So I wanted to ask you, do you think that the experiences of women during the war that he was alluding to helped usher in the feminist movement? Or did it usher in the 50s where we had more women staying at home and returning to the home? What do you think the relationship is there?
That's a really good question. I wanted just to bring up first, like when you write a book like this, I've had readers reach out to me and say things like, "Oh, my grandma was a mechanic on airplanes," and or my great aunt sewed parachutes. In fact, when I was researching this book, I went to the Hill Airspace Museum, which is about 30 minutes from me. And they have, like, the Air Force is there. And I talked to Air Force vets who had told me they had been trained by former WASP. And so these women that had flown as a WASP during World War II, and then they ended up training other pilots. And so you have like this full circle moment of all these women going to work during the war. They're all working for a cause. They're also gaining new skills. A lot of them maybe have not worked outside the home in that type of capacity. Um, but they're really putting their hearts and souls into these jobs. And so you feel that unifying effect, when you're in the same industry and you're working and you're supporting each other, where I feel like some of them probably did long for, oh, I wish I could stay at home, especially if I had children. I wish I could, be at home again, but this is just kind of a short time period that I need to be at work every day. But then as the war ended, I'm sure there were a lot of mixed feelings of, I really love this job, or I felt like I can progress, or I can learn more things or new things. And some just wanted to kind of say, no, I want to stay at home and, pass along my knowledge to my children that I'm raising. But I also think that it's one thing to have a choice, and it's another thing not to have a choice, where a lot of these women didn't have a choice. They were sent back home. And now today we do have a choice. We can sometimes just work at home, and we can do both. We can be a mother, we can go into the workforce, we can balance it. So I feel like the answer to your question is that yes, that this definitely got another rung in the ladder as far as women's rights goes. And definitely, with the war, it enabled women, and it showed them that you can be valued in the workforce. And so they kind of took that to heart. And so I would just say, though, that there's probably, I mean, you can't really say all women did this or all women did that, of course, because we're all still different. But I grew up in a home where my mother was working by choice. She didn't have to. My father did. He was a professor. My mother taught school, and also my grandmother taught school. Both my grandmothers were school teachers as well. One was widowed, and so for her, it was a necessity. The other one, as soon as her youngest was in kindergarten, she went and got her teaching certificate renewed. And so yeah, it's a complicated question, but definitely I think helped shape that feminist movement in the 60s.
Yeah, very interesting. My grandmother was one of those who went to work for a little bit in the Bell Aerospace factory
Oh,
in
wow.
Niagara Falls during the war, and then subsequently stayed home, during the 50s and had that
Yeah.
same trajectory. So that's very interesting what you shared. And we see these themes just you're laying the foundation for so much in this book. That's why I just thought it was so interesting. Thank you.
Well, I love that you're showing that women could make a difference even back then when they weren't treated equally. And you, for our readers, you brought up some interesting facts about female pilots back then. The qualifications and requirements were not always just between men and women. I'm going to name a few. Women who were pregnant could not pilot. Women in menopause could not pilot. The age cap for a woman pilot was 25 to 35 years old. Wow. But then, when in crisis, as you just mentioned, during the war, suddenly women were allowed to ferry the planes for the Army Air Corps. They were teaching the pilots how to fly. They were risking their lives, but they were only considered civilian pilots. They were never allowed the non-combat military service titles. I want to throw this little fact in, despite Eleanor Roosevelt fighting on their behalf. I just sat there and thought, there's something really honorable about any woman today or yesterday who fights for a cause, who wants to join a cause without getting the notoriety. Just satisfied sometimes that they're able to help in the war effort and they're able to make a difference. Was that a little bit who Nancy Harkness Love was?
Yes, I mean, I believe so. And you brought up the point of sexism, which was really quite mind-boggling, especially when this was relatively modern America. Other countries were far ahead of America in this, and they allowed women to ferry planes like England did, and the Soviet Union actually had an all-female bombing squad. So you have Nancy Love and also Jackie Cochran, who is part of the program. And Jackie had been petitioning for military inclusion since the very start of the war. And Eleanor Roosevelt was connected with Jackie, and she had published multiple times in her column about supporting women ferrying pilots and about saying, why are we not using this wonderful resource that America has? And it wasn't until the bombing of Pearl Harbor that the Army Air Corps took the petitions from both Nancy and Jackie seriously. And it was really based on simple math because they said, well, if the women could ferry the planes, then that allows the men to free up their time so then they can train for combat and then go into the war. And so it literally saved the military hundreds of thousands of hours for the women to do this service. But in order to get the women militarized, it would have to go through Congress, which would have been just months and months of red tape. And so that's why the women were brought in as civilian pilots, which which was great to get the program started. But at the end of the program, it meant that there was no military benefits, no veteran help that came. There were women that died in the service and they had no funeral recognition. And so the families had to raise the money to transport the bodies. They didn't have military honors at their funerals. And so there's definitely setbacks. And the interesting thing is, of all the research I've done about Nancy, is is you obviously had to have that heart of courage to just go fly a plane, right? But she was not necessarily an attention seeker. There were female pilots who were. I mean, we know Amelia Earhart, she, set incredible records. There's a lot of women that entered air races. They're breaking records left and right. But Nancy, even though she loved flying, she was also very careful, methodical about it. And which actually made her a good leader because she was in it for like the greater good and the bigger picture and not just for her own setting records, that type of thing.
Mhm. That's wonderful. Thank you.
We've talked a lot about history and overcoming obstacles, but also at the heart of your story were beautiful friendships and relationships. And I want to ask you about one of those, and that is the relationship between Nancy and Bob. Now, he cherished her, he supported her, he never answered for her, he tried to open doors when he could for her. And many men at that time were not so open-minded. So I wanted to ask you a little bit about, why was Bob different? Do you think it's because maybe they met on equal footing, so to speak?
Yeah, I do. I think so actually one of the reasons I picked Nancy Love to write about, because when I was talking with my publisher, we wanted to write about we were talking about a female aviator that was based in the United States and contributed to the war effort. So there's quite a few to choose from. And I picked Nancy Love as I started reading her story and read about her husband. I thought, wow, he really contributed a lot as well. But they had that unique relationship where they kind of butted heads when they first met, but they were also very supportive of each other, and especially him of her. So it made me think of, well, who was Bob? Like, what was his upbringing like? And he kind of also grew up in a more wealthy family. And he went to boarding school as a kid and he ended up at Princeton for a short time, but then he dropped out because he also fell in love with aviation in his early 20s and he decided he wanted to start an air school. And so he was also a bit of a maverick, I think, like Nancy's brother. And so I think she was drawn to someone that was similar to her brother as far as like attitude toward women and supportive women. And so that's why I think they connected. But of course, Nancy was a fully skilled pilot when she met him. So it wasn't like she was on this journey of should I, shouldn't I? Like she wanted to fly and it was already her passion. And so he just, that's who she was. And he kind of knew what he was getting into when he met her. Um, and also maybe more on a serious note is he had almost died of polio as a child. His brother had died of a disease. And so I think he embraced life to its fullest. He knew that life was short and he was not the person to tell someone they couldn't follow their own dreams.
Yeah. I loved that there was a mutual respect there and that
Yeah.
things built from there. It was a really beautiful story, just that angle. Well, that's wonderful. Well, first of all, we love talking to you about your stories because they're always
Mhm.
so deep and so many really cool themes running through them. Before we let you go, I wanted to see if you might share what you're working on next, maybe a little clue.
Oh, sure. We're just starting edits on my next historical novel. It's on Julia Child. And she, of course, is the big French chef. And the first half of the book deals with her years serving in World War II for the OSS, which is a precursor to the CIA. And she worked in Ceylon, which is now Sri Lanka. And that's actually where she met her husband. She was 34 and her husband was 10 years older. And then the second part of the book is how she ends up in Paris he works for the government over there. And she falls in love head over heels with French cooking, and she has to learn how to cook it herself. And so it starts this huge journey of, I think it was almost, I can't say the number of years, but it was like over 10 years before she finally got her cookbook published. So it's like just and it's a totally different story than this book. It's because Julia Child is just a personality that's just larger than life, and her entire life was just fascinating.
I cannot wait to read that book. I
That
know
sounds
Chris probably the same thing. Oh my
great.
goodness. Well, wonderful. Well, thank you. I'm going to tell our listeners how to get in contact with you. I know they will want to. They're going to want to pick up this fantastic book. And you've got a website, HBMoore, MOORE.com. You're on Pinterest, on Instagram, on Facebook, on X. And we just encourage everyone to run out, get this wonderful book. There's just so much to think about and talk about with this one, and it's entertaining. So thank you very much for coming on the show to talk about it.
Well,
Thanks.
thanks so much. You guys are on my favorites list on Spotify, so I listen to all your episodes. They're amazing. Thank you
Awesome.
so much.
Yay. Thanks,
Thank
Heather.
you. Take care now,
Bye-bye.
Heather.
See you. Bye, everyone.
Wow, I just love talking to her. And when you read a book like this is what I love about historical. You learn so much that you may not have known before. There
Yeah.
was one wonderful quote that I wanted to say for our listeners. Oscar Schiskal, the Cincinnati Enquirer, wrote about Nancy Love. He said this: I can hear a plane. It's quite possible that somewhere up there, alone in the open cockpit of a trainer plane, she is delivering. A girl is shivering in the wet wind, knowing she'll have to be alone and cold another 7 or 8 hours. She's flying up there, a mile above the earth, so that some man may be released to fight for his country. I thought that was a wonderful quote about her.
Yeah, absolutely. And, we didn't even touch on this angle, but not only was she up there shivering and freezing and alone, but she had the weight of a lot of lives on her shoulders. And not just the lives of the pilots and men she was transporting, but even other women who were working alongside of her, and she was sending them on missions. And so there was, we got to remember these are younger women in their 20s, many of them, and some, very early 20s. And they were making these tremendously important decisions, critical decisions. I was so impressed with everything in the story. And I know you and I have been talking about that. So
And
that's pretty
because
cool.
of them, because of women like this who did not get the notoriety, now we have women in the military. It's commonplace.
Yeah.
Someone has to always start. The starting can be difficult, but we're thankful to her. It's a great story.
Yeah, it really is. Well, we've got a few other authors I think that will also be of great interest to our listeners. And I want to just give you a peek. Jessica Hagedorn with Dog Eaters, Victor Mythos, The Silent Watcher, Graham Brown writing for the Clive Cussler series Desolation Code, Alex Hay, The Queen of Fives, Fiona Davis, The Stolen Queen, Carter Wilson, Tell Me What You Did, Jill Shelvis, Better Than Friends, Mark Greaney, Midnight Black, Andrews and Wilson Are Coming Back, Defense Protocol, Marshall Karp, Don't Tell Me How to Die, Samantha Green Woodruff, The Trade-Off, Brett Battle, Stuart Woods' Golden Hour, and Tess Gerritsen, The Summer Guest. Those are just a few. Listeners, thank you for spreading our socials, for tuning in. I love that Heather's listening to our other interviews. It's fantastic. We love getting notes from you. So just thank you for tuning in and listening. And we can always be found on Facebook, on Instagram, on X, at our website, bookstormpodcast.com, and of course on YouTube. Search for Bookstorm and Podcast and we'll come right up. Until next time, listeners, one of the best ways to brave the storm is to dive down deep into life-changing fiction.